The abandoned research facility sat deep in the Colorado mountains, its broken windows reflecting nothing but darkness. Dr. Marcus Chen had come here to die quietly, haunted by the genetic experiments that had cost him everything, his career, his family, his soul. But the savage growling echoing from the kennels changed everything. Inside a reinforced cage marked Specimen 47, Termination Pending, was a puppy unlike any he'd seen. Its eyes held an intelligence that chilled him, and scars covered its small body like a roadmap of torture. Against every instinct screaming danger, Marcus broke the lock. What he didn't know was that this wasn't just any puppy. It was the result of decades of classified human-canine genetic fusion, designed to be the perfect weapon. 3 months later, when the dog began displaying abilities that defied every law of biology, Marcus realized he hadn't just saved an animal, he'd rescued humanity's future, but the shadowy organization that created it would burn the world to get it back. Could one broken scientist and his extraordinary companion survive long enough to unlock the secret that could evolve mankind forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached through the cage bars. The puppy, if it could even be called that, bared teeth too sharp for its size, muscles coiled beneath its mottled fur like steel cables. Its coat was an unusual grey-silver that seemed to shimmer in the pale moonlight filtering through the broken skylights above. "Easy," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was comforting the animal or himself. The creature's eyes tracked his movement with predatory focus, pupils dilated in the darkness. Those eyes bothered him most, too knowing, too aware. They belonged in a human face, not on a dog barely 8 weeks old. The facility reeked of abandoned experiments and chemical decay. Marcus had driven here on impulse, drawn by news reports of the mysterious government lab closure 6 months ago. The official story claimed structural damage from a minor earthquake, but Marcus recognized the sanitized language of a cover-up. He'd heard it enough times during his own downfall. As his fingers brushed the puppy's fur, it flinched but didn't bite. The contact sent an electric jolt up his arm, not painful but startling. The sensation reminded him of static electricity, but deeper, as if the current flowed beneath the skin rather than across it. "What did they do to you?" Marcus murmured, noting the surgical scars crisscrossing the animal's body. Some were old, healed into pink lines, while others appeared fresher. The methodical pattern suggested systematic modification rather than random abuse. The puppy's growl softened into something almost like a whimper. Marcus had spent 20 years working with genetic modification before the Harvard incident destroyed his reputation. He'd seen plenty of lab animals, but none had ever looked at him with such raw intelligence mixed with desperate hope. Documents scattered across nearby tables caught his attention. Most were water-damaged beyond reading, but fragments revealed enough to make his blood run cold. Project Chimera, neural enhancement protocols, something called the Convergence Initiative. The few legible passages described genetic splicing techniques that pushed far beyond anything he'd imagined possible. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the facility. Marcus froze, listening. Wind through broken vents, maybe, or settling debris. He'd assumed the place was completely deserted, but isolation bred paranoia. His own cabin was 40 miles away, chosen specifically for its distance from prying eyes and painful memories. The puppy's head tilted at the sound, ears pricked forward. Its hearing was clearly superior to human normal. Another modification, perhaps. Marcus made his decision quickly, scooping the animal into his jacket before it could protest. The puppy felt heavier than it should, its bones denser than natural canine anatomy would suggest. "We're leaving," he whispered, padding quietly toward the exit. The puppy settled against his chest with surprising trust, though Marcus could feel tension in its small frame, ready to explode into violence at the first sign of threat. Outside, his rusted pickup truck waited in the shadow of towering pines. The October air bit through his jacket as he settled the puppy on the passenger seat. Those unsettling eyes studied the vehicle's interior with obvious curiosity rather than fear. Most dogs would be cowering after their ordeal. This one seemed to be analyzing escape routes. The drive back to his cabin passed in silence, broken only by the engine's labored breathing on mountain grades. Marcus found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger. The puppy sat perfectly still, watching the landscape roll past with an attention span far exceeding normal canine limits. At his cabin, Marcus prepared a makeshift bed from old blankets and set out water and canned soup, the closest thing to food he had that might work for a young dog. The puppy approached both cautiously, sniffing with obvious intelligence before consuming everything with mechanical efficiency. "What am I going to call you?" Marcus asked, settling into his threadbare armchair. The puppy looked up from its water dish, head cocked as if actually considering the question. That was when Marcus first noticed the faint luminescence in its eyes, a subtle glow that hadn't been visible in the facility's dim lighting. His scientific mind raced with possibilities, none of them natural. He'd rescued something extraordinary. The question was whether it would prove to be salvation or his final doom. The puppy's eyes snapped open the moment Marcus stepped into his makeshift lab, amber irises tracking his movement with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. No ordinary dog watched the world like that, calculating, measuring, waiting. "Easy there," Marcus murmured, approaching the improvised kennel he'd constructed from wire mesh and aluminum sheeting. The animal hadn't touched the water or kibble he'd left, but it no longer trembled. Instead, it sat perfectly still, muscles coiled beneath its dark fur like springs ready to release. Marcus had spent the sleepless hours since the rescue analyzing what he'd witnessed at the facility. The security protocols, the specialized equipment, the way that Guard had spoken about the asset. None of it aligned with standard animal testing. This was something else entirely. He crouched beside the kennel, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "What did they do to you?" The puppy tilted its head, and Marcus could have sworn he saw recognition flicker across its features, not the simple awareness of a domestic animal, but something deeper, something that shouldn't exist in a creature barely 8 weeks old. His tablet chimed with an incoming message. Marcus glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice. The sender was listed as unknown, but the message itself made his hands shake. "Dr. Chen, we know you have our property. Return it within 24 hours and your interference will be overlooked. Refuse and face the consequences of your theft." They'd found him already. Somehow, despite his careful preparation and the remote location of his compound, they'd tracked him down in less than 12 hours. Marcus deleted the message and powered down the tablet, his mind racing through escape protocols he'd hoped never to use. A soft whimper drew his attention back to the puppy. It was pawing at the kennel door, no longer aggressive but somehow urgent, as if it understood the danger they both faced. "Yeah, I get it," Marcus said, unlatching the enclosure. "We need to move." The moment the door swung open, the puppy bounded out, not toward freedom, but directly to Marcus's workstation. It began pawing at a specific drawer, whining with increasing intensity. Marcus frowned. "What is it?" He pulled open the drawer, revealing an assortment of portable diagnostic equipment. The puppy immediately focused on a handheld DNA sequencer, touching its nose to the device. "You want me to scan you?" Marcus asked, feeling ridiculous for conversing with an animal that couldn't possibly understand him. But the puppy sat back on its haunches and fixed him with that unnerving stare, waiting. Marcus picked up the sequencer, his scientific curiosity overriding his survival instincts. "This is insane," he muttered, but he activated the device anyway. The puppy remained perfectly still as he took a tissue sample, more cooperative than any lab animal he'd ever worked with. The preliminary results appeared on the small screen within minutes, and Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The base genetic structure was canine, but overlaid with something else, sequences he didn't recognize, patterns that followed no evolutionary logic he understood. Sections of the code seemed to shift and change even as he watched, as if the DNA itself was actively rewriting. "Impossible," he breathed. The puppy barked once, sharp, commanding, and suddenly every piece of electronic equipment in the lab activated simultaneously. Computers booted up, diagnostic machines hummed to life, and his backup generators kicked in, despite having no reason to engage. Marcus stumbled backward, watching in horror as data began streaming across every available screen. Not random information, but specific files. His files, research he'd conducted years ago on genetic enhancement and evolutionary acceleration, projects that had been buried, classified, and supposedly destroyed after his disgrace. The puppy walked calmly to the center of the lab and sat down, surrounded by the chaos of sparking electronics and cascading data. When it looked at Marcus again, its eyes held an ancient wisdom that made him question everything he thought he knew about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of life itself. One screen caught his attention, a document he'd never seen before, labeled Project Genesis Phase 3 Implementation. As he read, his hands began to shake. The file detailed something called evolutionary catalyst integration and accelerated species transition. At the bottom, stamped in red letters, was a single word: complete. The puppy had stopped being an animal the moment they'd created it. This wasn't genetic enhancement, it was transformation on a scale that defied comprehension, and somehow it had chosen him as its guardian. Outside, the distant sound of helicopter rotors began to echo off the canyon walls. Marcus looked at the creature that was simultaneously puppy and something far more dangerous. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" The puppy's response was to stand and walk toward the lab's rear exit, pausing to look back at him with an expression that clearly communicated, "Follow me if you want to live." The puppy's eyes snapped open at exactly 3:17 a.m., glowing like twin emeralds in the darkness of Marcus's cabin. He jolted awake on the couch where he'd been dozing fitfully, watching over his unexpected guest. The small creature sat perfectly still in the makeshift bed Marcus had constructed from old towels, but something had changed. The frantic, almost rabid energy from earlier had been replaced by an unsettling calm. "Hey there," Marcus whispered, slowly sitting up. The puppy's head turned toward him with mechanical precision, tracking his movement like a security camera. Those luminescent eyes never blinked. Marcus had seen plenty of genetic modifications in his years at Neo-Gen Labs: enhanced night vision, improved reflexes, accelerated healing. But this was different. The glow wasn't the typical tapetum lucidum reflection he'd expect from a dog's eyes. This was internal illumination, as if something was burning bright behind the retinas. He reached for the tablet he'd left on the coffee table and activated the camera function, zooming in on the puppy's face. Through the digital lens, he could see intricate patterns of light pulsing beneath the surface of those green orbs, neural networks firing in complex cascades that reminded him of synaptic mapping displays. His breath caught. Whatever had been done to this animal went far beyond simple genetic enhancement. The puppy stood and padded toward him with fluid grace, its earlier aggressive behavior completely absent. When it reached the couch, it sat and lifted one small paw. Marcus hesitated, remembering the vicious snarling from hours before, but something in the creature's posture suggested intelligence rather than instinct. Carefully, he extended his hand. The puppy placed its paw in his palm, and Marcus felt a jolt of electricity race up his arm. Not painful, but startling, like touching a live wire that somehow soothed rather than shocked. Images flashed through his mind: sterile laboratory corridors, the hum of centrifuges, the acrid smell of chemical sterilization. But these weren't his memories. He jerked his hand back, heart hammering. The puppy tilted its head, and Marcus could swear he saw something resembling curiosity in its expression, or perhaps disappointment. "What did they do to you?" he murmured, running his fingers through his unkempt hair. The puppy's tail wagged once, twice, then stopped as if the gesture had been calculated rather than emotional. Marcus grabbed his laptop and began typing, calling up files he'd kept buried since his exile from the scientific community. His work on neural integration, the research that had cost him everything when the ethics board deemed it too dangerous. If someone had taken his theoretical framework and applied it to living tissue. The puppy approached again, this time jumping onto the couch beside him. It peered at the screen with what appeared to be genuine interest, watching as Marcus scrolled through genetic sequences and neural pathway diagrams. When he pulled up a three-dimensional model of enhanced synaptic connections, the puppy let out a soft whine that sounded almost like recognition. "You understand this, don't you?" Marcus whispered. It seemed impossible, but the animal's behavior suggested not just intelligence, but comprehension of complex scientific concepts. He thought about the memory flash he'd experienced. If the puppy could somehow transmit thoughts or images. A distant rumble made them both freeze. The sound of vehicles approaching through the forest, engines straining against the rough terrain. Marcus killed the laptop screen and crept to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains. Headlights carved through the darkness, at least 3 vehicles moving in formation up the old logging road that led to his cabin. The puppy was beside him instantly, pressing against his leg. The green glow of its eyes had intensified, and Marcus could feel tension radiating from its small body like heat from a furnace. Whatever was coming, the animal knew it meant danger. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. Random visitors were impossible. His cabin was 15 miles from the nearest road, hidden deep in protected forest land. Government agencies were more likely, but which ones? The CDC facility he'd raided was civilian, but the security response suggested military involvement. If they'd tracked him here. The puppy looked up at him, and for a moment Marcus felt that strange electrical connection again. This time, instead of memories, he sensed something else: urgency, determination, and underneath it all, a desperate need for protection. Not the animal seeking shelter from a human, but something far more complex, as if the puppy understood exactly what was at stake. "We need to go," Marcus said, already moving toward his emergency pack. He'd learned to stay prepared for rapid evacuation during his early days of exile, when paranoia had been his closest companion. Now that caution might save both their lives. The puppy bounded ahead of him, moving toward the back of the cabin with purpose. It stopped at the rear door and looked back, those glowing eyes fixed on Marcus with unmistakable intelligence. Somehow, it knew this wasn't just a retreat. This was the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than either of them could imagine. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Marcus finished securing the last of the lab equipment. Rain hammered against the cabin's windows with increasing intensity, and the wind howled through the pine trees surrounding his isolated sanctuary. He glanced at the puppy, who had been unusually restless all day, pacing the small living area and whimpering at sounds only she could hear. "Easy girl," he murmured, though he wasn't sure what to call her yet. Every name he'd considered seemed inadequate for something so extraordinary. The lights flickered once, then died completely. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The backup generator would only last 6 hours, maybe 8 if he was careful with power consumption. More concerning was what the outage might represent. In his experience, power grids rarely failed during storms unless someone wanted them to. The puppy's behavior shifted immediately. Her ears perked up, and she moved to the window facing the access road, a low growl building in her throat. The sound raised the hair on Marcus's arms. It was too deep, too threatening for something barely 8 weeks old. Marcus grabbed his binoculars and peered through the rain-streaked glass. At first, he saw nothing but swaying trees and sheets of water. Then, barely visible through the storm, he caught the faint glow of headlights moving up the mountain road. Multiple vehicles, their lights cutting through the darkness in a steady procession. His blood turned to ice. No one came up this road by accident, especially not in weather like this. He'd chosen this location precisely because it was isolated, accessible only by a single winding path that he could monitor. Whoever was coming knew exactly where they were going. "We need to move," he said to the puppy, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Now. He'd prepared for this possibility, though he'd hoped it would never come. A go-bag waited by the back door, containing essential supplies, cash, and forged documents. His most critical research data was stored on encrypted drives he could grab in seconds. But looking at the puppy now, he realized his careful preparations hadn't accounted for traveling with a companion, especially one whose very existence was apparently worth killing for. The vehicles were closer now, maybe 10 minutes away. Marcus moved quickly through the cabin, gathering what he needed. The puppy followed his movements with intelligent eyes, as if she understood the gravity of their situation. When he shouldered the backpack and moved toward the rear exit, she was already waiting by the door. "Smart girl," he whispered, then paused. Something about her posture bothered him. She wasn't frightened like a normal puppy would be. Instead, she seemed alert, focused, almost predatory. The realization sent another chill through him. They slipped out into the storm just as the first vehicle's headlights became clearly visible through the trees. Marcus had mapped every trail and game path within a 5-mile radius of the cabin. In daylight, he could navigate them blindfolded. In this weather, with potential hostiles closing in, it would be considerably more challenging. The puppy moved beside him with surprising confidence, her small paws finding purchase on the slippery ground better than his boots. Rain soaked through his jacket within minutes, and the wind threatened to knock him off balance with every step. But they pressed on, following a narrow deer trail that led deeper into the wilderness. Behind them, Marcus heard engines shutting off, then the slam of car doors. Voices carried on the wind, though he couldn't make out the words. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the trees around the cabin. Professional search patterns, he noted grimly, military or law enforcement training. They'd been hiking for perhaps 20 minutes when the puppy suddenly stopped. Her ears swiveled forward, and that low growl returned. Marcus strained to listen over the storm, then heard it, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. His heart sank. Ground teams were one thing, but air support meant they had resources he couldn't hope to match. "This way," he urged, leading them off the trail toward denser forest cover. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the mountainside, a brilliant white beam that turned the rain into glittering sheets. They pressed against the trunk of a massive pine as the aircraft passed overhead. In the brief illumination, Marcus caught sight of the puppy's eyes. They reflected the light like mirrors, but there was something else, an intelligence that seemed far too old for her young body. For a moment, he had the unsettling feeling that she was evaluating him, measuring his capability as an ally. The helicopter moved on, but Marcus knew it would return. They needed shelter, somewhere to wait out the storm and the search. His cabin had been compromised, his carefully constructed life shattered in a single evening. But as he looked at the extraordinary creature beside him, he felt a familiar spark of purpose igniting in his chest. Whatever she was, whatever they'd done to create her, she was in his care now, and Marcus Chen had never backed down from protecting something worth saving. The morning air carried the scent of pine and dew as Marcus stepped onto his cabin's weathered porch, coffee mug in hand. 3 weeks had passed since he'd brought the puppy home, and the animal had grown at an alarming rate. What had been a 20-pound ball of fur was now pushing 50 pounds of lean muscle and intelligent amber eyes. "Nova," he called softly, using the name that had somehow stuck after watching the dog's eyes literally glow in the dark during their second night together. The effect had lasted only seconds, but Marcus knew what he'd seen. The dog emerged from the tree line with something clenched in his jaws, a rabbit, freshly killed and unmarked except for what appeared to be a single precise bite to the neck. Marcus set down his coffee, his scientific mind immediately cataloguing the impossibility of what he was witnessing. Nova couldn't have caught a rabbit through normal means. The kill was too clean, too surgical. "How did you—" Marcus began, but Nova dropped the rabbit and tilted his head, those unsettling amber eyes meeting his with an intelligence that made the hair on his arms stand up. For a moment, Marcus could have sworn he felt something brush against his thoughts, a whisper of alien consciousness that made him step back involuntarily. The satellite phone in his cabin began ringing. Marcus hesitated, staring at Nova, who had gone completely still. In 3 years of isolation, the phone had rung exactly twice, both times wrong numbers. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on the dog, and grabbed the handset on the 4th ring. Marcus Chen. His voice came out rougher than intended. Dr. Chen, this is Director Sarah Reeves with the Department of Genetic Security. I believe you have something that belongs to us. The blood in Marcus's veins turned to ice water. He'd never heard of the Department of Genetic Security, but government agencies had a way of spawning new acronyms faster than he could track them. Through the window, he watched Nova's head snap toward the access road, ears pricked forward. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said carefully. Subject 17. Removed from the Blackwood Research Facility 3 weeks ago during what our security footage shows was a carefully planned extraction. We have thermal imaging of you carrying the asset to your vehicle. Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. Asset. They were calling Nova an asset. I found an injured animal and provided medical care. Last I checked, that wasn't a federal crime. Dr. Chen, I'm going to be very direct with you. What you removed from that facility represents a breakthrough that could change the course of human evolution. It's also extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. We need it back. And if I refuse? The pause stretched long enough for Marcus to count his heartbeats. Outside, Nova had begun pacing in tight circles, a low whine building in his throat. Your work on Project Prometheus was groundbreaking before the incident. The genetic therapy protocols you developed saved lives, even if the implementation went wrong. We're prepared to offer you a full reinstatement, complete with research facilities and funding. All we need is your cooperation. The carrot. Marcus had been expecting the stick, but the offer hit him like a physical blow. 7 years of exile, 7 years of wondering if he'd ever practice real science again. And here was someone dangling everything he'd lost back in front of him. What exactly is he? Marcus asked, surprised by his own words. Bring subject 17 to the coordinates I'm about to give you, and we'll explain everything. You have 24 hours, Dr. Chen. After that, we come to you, and the conversation becomes much less pleasant. The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down with shaking hands and looked out at Nova, who was now staring directly at him through the window. The dog's amber eyes held an expression that was almost human: fear, intelligence, and something that looked disturbingly like betrayal, as if he'd understood every word of the conversation. Marcus opened the door and stepped outside. Nova approached cautiously, his massive head lowered in what might have been submission or preparation to bolt. When the dog was close enough to touch, Marcus knelt down and placed a hand on his neck. The moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded Marcus's mind. Laboratories filled with cages, scientists in hazmat suits, needles and surgical instruments gleaming under harsh lights. Pain beyond description, confusion, terror. And underneath it all, a desperate hunger for something Marcus couldn't identify. A biological imperative that felt alien and urgent. The connection lasted only seconds before Marcus jerked his hand away, gasping. Nova stepped back, ears flattened, but his eyes never left Marcus's face. Jesus, Marcus whispered. What did they do to you? In the distance, barely audible over the wind in the trees, came the sound of helicopter rotors. They were still far off, but growing closer. 24 hours, Director Reeves had said. Apparently, she'd lied. The underground laboratory hummed with the familiar sound of equipment Dr. Marcus Chen hadn't heard in 3 years. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as he descended the concrete steps. The puppy, he'd started calling him Nexus, padding silently beside him. The hidden facility beneath his cabin had been his insurance policy, a place to continue his work away from government oversight and academic condemnation. Now it might be their salvation. Nexus sniffed the air cautiously, his enhanced senses no doubt cataloguing every chemical trace in the sterile environment. The puppy had grown noticeably in the past week, his shoulders broader, his movements more coordinated. More unsettling were the moments when Marcus caught him staring with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure. The lab stretched across the basement's full footprint. Centrifuges, gene sequencers, microscopes, and banks of computers that Marcus had built from salvaged components. Everything he needed to understand what the government had done to this animal. Everything he needed to prove his theories about directed evolution. Marcus drew blood from Nexus with practiced efficiency. The puppy submitted without struggle, those unnaturally bright eyes tracking every movement. Sometimes Marcus wondered if Nexus understood more than he let on, if cooperation was a choice rather than conditioning. The genetic sequencer whirred to life, its displays painting Marcus's face in blue-white light. He'd run preliminary tests upstairs, but this equipment could dig deeper, reveal the structural modifications that conventional analysis might miss. As the machine worked, Marcus pulled up his old research files, the theoretical frameworks that had gotten him expelled from the scientific community. Transgenic enhancement wasn't new. Scientists had been inserting foreign genes into laboratory animals for decades, but Marcus's work had suggested something more radical, that consciousness itself could be encoded, transferred, and amplified through genetic manipulation. Not just intelligence, but awareness, creativity, the spark that separated sentient beings from sophisticated biological machines. The sequencer chimed. Marcus's hands trembled as he accessed the results. "Impossible," he whispered. Nexus's genome was a masterpiece of genetic engineering, but not in any way Marcus had anticipated. Instead of foreign DNA inserted into canine chromosomes, he found something far more elegant and terrifying. The puppy's genetic code had been rewritten using what appeared to be human neural mapping sequences, but not from any single individual. The modifications incorporated neural patterns from dozens of different people, their cognitive architectures somehow translated into genetic instructions and woven into Nexus's developing brain structure. It was as if someone had taken the greatest minds of a generation and compressed their capabilities into a single organism. Marcus cross-referenced the patterns against public genetic databases. Dr. Sarah Chen, his own sister, the neuroscientist who died in a lab accident 5 years ago. Dr. James Morrison, the quantum physicist who disappeared during a classified project. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the systems analyst whose suicide had shocked the tech community. All of them dead, all of them brilliant, all of them now living again, in a sense, within this impossible puppy. The basement air suddenly felt thick, oppressive. Marcus realized he was looking at evidence of the most audacious scientific crime in human history. Someone had harvested neural patterns from deceased geniuses and used them to create a hybrid consciousness. The implications staggered him, not just the violation of human dignity, but the technological breakthroughs required to make such a thing possible. Nexus whimpered softly and pressed against Marcus's leg. The puppy's eyes held a depth of understanding that now made horrible sense. How much of those original minds survived in this new form? How much did Nexus remember of lives he'd never lived? A soft chime from his security system made Marcus's blood freeze. Motion sensors along his property perimeter were triggering in sequence, indicating multiple contacts moving through the forest with military precision. He pulled up the external cameras on his workstation. Black SUVs had parked at the tree line, and figures in tactical gear were advancing through the woods toward his cabin. Even in the grainy night vision footage, Marcus could see they carried weapons and moved with professional coordination. "They found us," he said, though Nexus had already begun to growl, a sound that carried harmonics no normal dog could produce. Marcus's hands flew across the keyboard, copying his research data to encrypted drives. Everything he'd discovered about Nexus's true nature had to be preserved, had to reach the outside world. The genetic sequences alone proved that someone in the government or working with government resources had committed atrocities that made his own disgraced experiments look like children's games. Footsteps echoed from the cabin above. They were inside already, searching room by room. Marcus grabbed the data drives and shoved them into a hidden compartment within his equipment rack. If he didn't survive this, maybe someday someone would find the truth. Nexus's growling intensified, and the lights in the laboratory began to flicker in rhythm with the sound. The puppy's eyes were glowing now, not reflecting light, but generating it from within. Whatever dormant capabilities his hybrid consciousness possessed, they were activating in response to the threat. The basement door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and smoke. The morning air carried the acrid smell of smoke and burnt electronics as Marcus crouched behind a fallen oak tree, watching the smoldering remains of his cabin through binoculars. Government vehicles surrounded the property. Black SUVs, a mobile command unit, and what looked like a specialized containment truck with reinforced steel plating. Nova pressed against his leg, her small body trembling. The puppy's eyes had been glowing faintly since they'd fled in the pre-dawn darkness, and Marcus could feel an odd vibration emanating from her, like a tuning fork struck against bone. "They found us faster than I expected," he whispered, lowering the binoculars. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. They'd been hiding in the forest for 3 hours, and Nova was beginning to shiver despite her thick coat. A figure emerged from the command unit, and Marcus's blood chilled. Director Sarah Chen, his former colleague, former friend, and the woman who'd orchestrated his professional destruction 5 years ago. Even from this distance, he recognized her precise movements and the way she held herself like a blade ready to cut. She was speaking into a radio, gesturing toward the tree line where Marcus and Nova were hidden. Had they somehow tracked them? Marcus mentally catalogued their escape route, trying to remember if they'd left any traces. Nova suddenly went rigid. Her ears pricked forward. A low growl built in her throat, but this wasn't the normal sound of an alarmed dog. The growl had harmonics, layers of frequency that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. The hair on his arms stood up. "Easy, girl," he murmured. But Nova's glow was intensifying. Through the binoculars, Marcus watched Chen's team suddenly stop their coordinated search pattern. Several agents grabbed their heads, stumbling. One man fell to his knees, pressing his palms against his ears. Nova's growl deepened, and Marcus felt a pressure building in his skull, not painful but insistent, like someone gently pushing against his consciousness. The sensation was accompanied by images that weren't quite his own. The government facility, sterile corridors, cages filled with modified animals, and something else, a vast network of interconnected minds, a web of awareness that stretched beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The pressure in his head intensified, and suddenly Marcus understood. Nova wasn't just growling at the agents below, she was communicating with something, or someone. Chen's radio crackled loud enough for Marcus to hear fragments even from their hiding spot. Multiple contacts approaching, not on any surveillance, requesting immediate backup. Through the binoculars, Marcus saw them, wolves emerging from the forest on the opposite side of the clearing. But these weren't ordinary wolves. They moved with unnatural coordination, their eyes reflecting the morning light with the same soft glow he'd seen in Nova's. There were dozens of them, appearing from multiple directions simultaneously. "Impossible," Marcus breathed. The nearest wolf population was hundreds of miles away. Nova's growl shifted to something else, a complex vocalization that seemed to contain multiple conversations happening at once. The wolves responded, their own calls creating a symphony of communication that made Marcus's scientific mind reel with possibilities. Chen's team was in full retreat now, agents running for their vehicles as the wolves closed in. But the animals weren't attacking. They were herding, forcing the humans toward a specific exit route with the precision of a military operation. One wolf, larger than the others and bearing distinctive silver markings, approached their hiding spot. Marcus tensed, ready to run, but Nova bounded forward eagerly. The two animals touched noses, and Marcus felt that strange pressure in his head again, gentler now, almost welcoming. Images flooded his mind, a laboratory deep underground, rows of genetic modification chambers, scientists in hazmat suits, working with DNA sequences he'd never seen before. But these weren't memories. They were current events, happening now. Somehow, through Nova, he was seeing through the eyes of other modified animals scattered across the facility network. The large wolf turned amber eyes on Marcus, and he felt a presence touch his consciousness. Ancient, intelligent, and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. Not the wolf's mind, but something else. Something that had been sleeping in genetic sequences until the right combination of modifications had awakened it. Chen's convoy was retreating down the mountain road, harassed by coordinated wolf packs that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The message was clear: the facility's creations were no longer contained. Nova trotted back to Marcus, her glow fading to its normal soft luminescence. But when she looked up at him, her eyes held depths that hadn't been there before, as if something vast and patient had taken notice of him. The silver-marked wolf gave a final call that echoed across the mountain, answered by dozens of voices from the surrounding forest. Then the pack melted away as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only Marcus, Nova, and the smoking remains of his former life. Marcus picked up Nova, feeling her warm weight against his chest. Whatever had just happened, there was no going back now. They were part of something larger, something that Chen and her superiors couldn't control or contain. And somehow, that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched into darkness ahead of them, water dripping steadily from rusted pipes overhead. Marcus adjusted his grip on the emergency supply pack, while Nova padded silently beside him, her enhanced senses constantly scanning for threats. They'd been underground for 6 hours now, following a route Marcus had mapped years ago during his more paranoid moments. Moments that no longer seemed paranoid at all. "We can rest here," he whispered, indicating a maintenance alcove hidden behind a concrete pillar. The space was cramped but dry, and more importantly, it was invisible from the main tunnel. Nova immediately settled against his leg, her warmth welcome in the damp chill. Marcus pulled out his tablet and activated its shielded mode, running a diagnostic on the genetic samples he'd managed to salvage from his lab. The results made his blood run cold. The viral vector Thompson's team had been developing wasn't just designed to replicate Nova's abilities, it was engineered to be fatal to anyone whose genetic markers didn't match a specific profile. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, scrolling through the data. The target parameters were chillingly precise. The virus would grant enhanced abilities to roughly 15% of the population, while killing the remaining 85% within 72 hours. It wasn't evolution Thompson was after. It was genocide with a veneer of scientific advancement. Nova lifted her head, sensing his distress. In the tablet's blue glow, her eyes reflected an almost human understanding. She pressed her muzzle against his hand, and suddenly Marcus felt that strange tingling sensation again. But this time, instead of images, he received something else. Emotions, clear and unmistakable. Comfort, determination. And underneath it all, a fierce protective instinct that reminded him she wasn't just a subject to be studied, but a partner in this fight. A distant rumble echoed through the tunnel. Marcus quickly shut off the tablet and pressed himself against the alcove wall, pulling Nova closer. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the whir of electronic equipment. Through the gap between the pillar and wall, he could see the sweep of tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Heat signatures show they came this way," a voice called out. "Female, professional, cold. The dog's body temperature runs 3 degrees higher than normal. Should be easy to track." Thompson wants them alive, another voice responded. But if the target resists, prioritize the asset. The engineer is replaceable. Marcus felt Nova tense beside him, her muscles coiling like springs. He placed a restraining hand on her back, knowing that despite her abilities, she was still outnumbered and outgunned. They needed to be smart about this. The search team moved past their hiding spot, but Marcus could tell they were systematically checking every alcove, every potential hiding place. It would only be minutes before they were discovered. He looked at Nova, seeing his own desperation reflected in her intelligent gaze. Then she did something that made his heart stop. Nova stood up, walked to the edge of their hiding spot, and let out a single sharp bark. Contact. Southeast tunnel, 50 meters. The tactical team immediately shifted direction, rushing toward the sound. But as their footsteps faded, Marcus realized Nova was still beside him. The bark had come from the opposite direction entirely. She'd somehow projected the sound. Before he could fully process this new ability, Nova was moving, leading him deeper into the tunnel system. Her confidence in the darkness was absolute, navigating turns and obstacles that would have been impossible for human eyes. Marcus followed, trusting her enhanced senses completely. They emerged from a service hatch 6 blocks away, surfacing in the basement of an abandoned department store. Nova immediately began sniffing the air, alert for any sign of pursuit. The coast seemed clear, but Marcus knew they had minutes at most before satellite surveillance picked up their trail again. His phone buzzed, a message from an encrypted number he didn't recognize. If you want answers about what they did to create her, meet me at the old Meridian Labs facility. Come alone. You have 12 hours before they activate the deployment protocol. A friend. Marcus stared at the message, his mind racing. Meridian Labs had been shuttered 5 years ago after a classified incident that had cost dozens of lives. If someone was asking him to meet there, they either had information worth the risk, or it was an elaborate trap. Nova nudged his leg, looking up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes. In them, he saw not just trust, but understanding. She knew the stakes as well as he did. Whatever she was, whatever they'd done to create her, she was evolving beyond their original parameters. The question was whether that evolution would be humanity's salvation or its destruction. "All right, girl," he whispered, shouldering his pack. "Looks like we're going back to where it all began." As they slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking directly into the heart of a conspiracy far larger than he'd imagined. The morning air cut through Marcus's jacket as he crouched behind the rusted water tank, watching the government facility through binoculars. 3 days of surveillance had revealed the pattern: shift change at 0600, skeleton crew until 0800, and a 15-minute window when the eastern perimeter was unwatched. Beside him, Nova's breathing remained steady, her enhanced physiology requiring less oxygen than any normal dog. Since their escape from the mountain lab, her abilities had continued evolving at an alarming rate. Yesterday, he'd watched her phase partially through a solid oak tree, her molecular structure somehow becoming permeable at will. "Remember what we discussed," he whispered, scratching behind her ears. "Stay close, stay quiet. We get in, access the central database, and get out." Nova's response came not as a bark, but as a direct transmission into his mind, a warm pulse of understanding that still unnerved him. The telepathic connection had strengthened over the past week, and with it came an uncomfortable realization he was changing too. His reflexes had sharpened, his vision improved in low light, and sometimes he could sense Nova's thoughts, even when she wasn't actively communicating. The guard rotation proceeded exactly as observed. Marcus checked his watch, 0617, time to move. They descended the hillside like shadows, Nova's paws making no sound on the gravel. The chain-link fence posed no barrier. Nova simply walked through it, her body briefly becoming translucent. Marcus had to cut his way through like a normal human, the wire snip seeming primitive by comparison. Inside the facility, emergency lighting cast everything in red. Marcus's enhanced vision, when had it become enhanced? picked out details that should have been invisible. Surveillance cameras tracked predetermined patterns, leaving gaps he could navigate with unnatural precision. The central laboratory was exactly where the stolen schematics indicated. Marcus plugged his modified tablet into the main console while Nova stood guard, her head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human range. Files cascaded across the screen: Project Chimera, evolutionary catalyst trials, adaptive gene therapy. His blood ran cold as he read deeper. Nova wasn't the only subject. There were others, dozens of them scattered across facilities nationwide. Dogs, cats, primates, all infected with the same mysterious pathogen that had transformed Nova. But the worst revelation came in a file marked Phase 3 implementation. The pathogen wasn't just affecting animals. Human trials had begun 6 months ago, using unwitting test subjects in urban areas. The evolutionary virus was already spreading through major population centers, dormant but present, waiting for some unknown trigger to activate. Jesus, Marcus breathed, downloading everything he could. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just about creating super soldiers or enhanced animals. Someone was orchestrating the next phase of human evolution, and they were using cities full of people as test subjects. Nova's warning came as a sharp mental jolt, just as alarms began blaring. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridors, too many to avoid. Marcus yanked the tablet free and spun toward the exit, but armed figures were already visible through the lab's windows. "Attention, Dr. Chen," a voice boomed over the intercom. "You're surrounded. Come out peacefully and the animal won't be harmed." Marcus's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle sounds of tactical teams moving into position. At least 12, possibly more. Nova pressed against his leg, her body temperature rising as her defensive systems activated. Through their connection, he felt her readiness to fight, but also her restraint. She was waiting for his decision, trusting him to find a solution that didn't require violence. The laboratory had one advantage: multiple chemical storage areas and experimental equipment that could be weaponized. Marcus grabbed a canister of liquid nitrogen and several vials of reactive compounds. Not to hurt anyone, despite everything, he wasn't ready to cross that line, but to create chaos. "On my mark," he whispered to Nova. He hurled the nitrogen canister toward the main entrance and immediately followed with a compound that would create thick, obscuring smoke. The explosion of vapor and hissing gas sent the tactical team scrambling for cover. Nova moved like lightning, her enhanced speed carrying her past confused soldiers before they could react. Marcus followed, his own improved reflexes keeping pace in ways that should have been impossible for a normal human. They burst through a side exit into the dawn light, but vehicles were already moving to intercept them. 3 black SUVs converged on their position, forcing them toward the facility's rear boundary. That's when Nova did something unprecedented. She stopped running, turned to face the approaching vehicles, and her eyes began to glow with an inner light. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from her small body killed every engine within a 100-yard radius, leaving the pursuit team stranded with dead vehicles. But the effort cost her. Nova collapsed, her breathing shallow, her enhanced abilities apparently pushed beyond safe limits. Marcus scooped her up and ran for the tree line, knowing they'd bought only minutes before backup arrived. As he carried his small companion to safety, one thought dominated his mind: if the government was willing to experiment on entire cities, then nowhere was truly safe. The data he'd stolen might be humanity's only chance to understand what was coming, and possibly to survive it. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city stretched endlessly in both directions, their concrete walls weeping with decades of accumulated moisture. Marcus pressed his back against the cold surface, listening for any sound of pursuit, while Coda sniffed at the rusted tracks nearby. 3 days had passed since their escape from the research facility, and the cramped maintenance tunnel they'd been hiding in had become unbearable. "We can't stay down here forever," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to the dog. His voice echoed slightly in the vast underground space. The emergency supplies he'd grabbed during their frantic exit were nearly depleted, and Koda's enhanced metabolism meant the animal needed far more food than a normal puppy. Koda's ears suddenly perked up, swiveling toward the northern tunnel. The dog's hackles rose, and that familiar blue shimmer began coursing beneath his dark fur. Marcus felt his stomach drop. In the past 72 hours, he'd witnessed Koda's abilities manifest in increasingly dramatic ways. The dog had somehow interfered with the electronic locks during their escape, and yesterday, Marcus could have sworn he'd seen Koda's eyes glow briefly in the dark. The sound of boots on concrete echoed from somewhere in the tunnel system, multiple pairs moving with military precision. "Damn it," Marcus breathed. He'd known Dr. Chen and her team wouldn't give up easily, but he'd hoped the maze of abandoned infrastructure would buy them more time. He grabbed what remained of their supplies and started moving deeper into the tunnel system, Koda padding silently beside him. The boots grew louder, definitely military. Marcus recognized the cadence from his years working with government contractors. They were being systematic, checking every branch of the tunnel network. It was only a matter of time before they were cornered. Koda suddenly veered left, disappearing through a gap in the tunnel wall that Marcus had initially missed. The opening was barely wide enough for a person, clearly not part of the original subway construction. Marcus squeezed through, scraping his shoulders against the rough concrete. The space beyond was larger than expected, some kind of forgotten utility chamber. Ancient pipes ran along the ceiling, and the air smelled of rust and stagnant water. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, suggesting the space still had some kind of power connection. "How did you know about this place?" Marcus asked quietly. Koda was sitting calmly in the center of the room, no longer showing signs of agitation. The blue energy patterns beneath his fur had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The boots passed by their hiding spot without slowing. Marcus held his breath until the sounds faded completely, then slumped against the wall in relief. They were safe for now, but the larger problem remained unsolved. Dr. Chen's resources were vast, and Marcus was beginning to realize that conventional hiding wouldn't work indefinitely. He pulled out his tablet, one of the few electronic devices he'd managed to salvage, and began reviewing the research data he'd copied from the facility. The genetic sequences were unlike anything in the scientific literature. Whole sections of Koda's DNA appeared to be artificially enhanced, but the sophistication of the modifications suggested technology far beyond current capabilities. "What the hell were they doing in that place?" Marcus muttered, scrolling through pages of incomprehensible genetic markers. Some of the sequences seemed to activate and deactivate in response to external stimuli, almost like a biological computer program. Koda wandered over and placed his head on Marcus's knee. The physical contact seemed to trigger something. The tablet screen suddenly blazed with activity as new data streams appeared. Marcus watched in fascination as the genetic sequences began reorganizing themselves, forming patterns that actually made sense. "You're interfacing with the computer somehow," Marcus whispered, afraid to move and break the connection. "That's not just enhanced intelligence. You're actually processing digital information." The implications were staggering. If Koda could directly interface with electronic systems, the applications were limitless. But it also explained why the government wanted him back so desperately. In the wrong hands, such an ability could be weaponized in terrifying ways. The data stream suddenly cut off as Koda lifted his head, alert again. This time, though, his posture suggested curiosity rather than threat. A new sound was approaching through the tunnels, not boots this time, but something wheeled. Marcus crept back to the entrance gap and peered out. A figure was moving through the tunnel, pushing a shopping cart loaded with various belongings, homeless most likely, and probably more familiar with these tunnels than anyone else in the city. He made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over the past few days. "Excuse me," Marcus called softly, stepping into the tunnel. The figure stopped, turning slowly. It was an elderly woman, her weathered face suspicious but not afraid. "You're not supposed to be down here," she said simply. "Neither are those soldiers who went by earlier." "We need help," Marcus said. "Both of us are in serious trouble." The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Marcus pressed himself against the rocky outcropping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the sparse mountain vegetation, he could see the black aircraft circling like a mechanical vulture, its searchlight sweeping the terrain in methodical arcs. Beside him, Echo crouched low, her enhanced muscles coiled with tension, her dark eyes tracking the aircraft's movement with predatory focus. "They found us faster than expected," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to the dog. The military-grade helicopter bore no identifying markings, but he knew exactly who had sent it. Director Valdez wasn't the type to give up easily, especially not when her prize specimen was involved. Echo's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, her hackles rising. Marcus had noticed her growing aggression toward anything that smelled of the facility, vehicles, uniforms, even the antiseptic scent that still clung to some of his old equipment. But this was different. Her entire body vibrated with an energy that seemed to bend the air around her, making his skin prickle with static electricity. The searchlight swept closer, and Marcus made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over the past months. Instead of running deeper into the cave system behind them, he placed his hand on Echo's head, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her skull. "Show me," he whispered. Echo's eyes snapped to his, and for a moment Marcus felt that familiar vertigo as their consciousness seemed to merge. Images flooded his mind, not memories this time, but possibilities. He saw electromagnetic fields as visible rivers of light, felt the helicopter's metal frame as a three-dimensional map of stress points and vulnerabilities. Through Echo's enhanced perception, the aircraft wasn't just a machine. It was a complex web of electrical systems, fuel lines, and structural weaknesses. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Echo wasn't just exhibiting enhanced strength or speed. She was developing the ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields on a molecular level. "My God," he breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You're not just evolved, you're evolving in real time." The helicopter banked sharply, its searchlight now probing the exact area where they were hidden. Marcus heard boots hitting the ground. A tactical team had fast-roped down while he'd been distracted by the revelation. They had perhaps 30 seconds before being discovered. Echo's growl deepened, and the air around them began to shimmer. Marcus felt his hair stand on end as an invisible force built between them and their pursuers. Through their shared consciousness, he sensed Echo reaching out with her mind, touching the electrical systems of the helicopter above. The aircraft's engines sputtered. "Echo, no," Marcus said urgently, gripping her fur. "If you bring that down, people could die." Her alien eyes fixed on his, and he felt her confusion. In her rapidly expanding consciousness, the soldiers weren't quite people. They were threats, extensions of the place that had hurt her, that had hurt him. The distinction between enemy and innocent was a human concept that her accelerated evolution hadn't yet grasped. "Listen to me," Marcus said, his voice carrying all the authority he could muster. "We're better than them. We don't kill unless we have no choice." The shimmering air stilled. Echo's head tilted, processing this new parameter in her constantly expanding worldview. Above them, the helicopter's engine smoothed out, but Marcus could hear the soldiers moving closer, their radio chatter growing louder. Echo's solution came with breathtaking efficiency. Instead of destroying the aircraft, she sent out a targeted electromagnetic pulse that fried every electronic device within a 100-meter radius. The helicopter's engines went silent, its rotors auto-rotating as the pilot executed an emergency landing. Night vision goggles sparked and died. Radio communication cut to static. Even the flashlights the soldiers carried flickered and failed. In the sudden darkness and confusion, Marcus felt Echo's mind brush against his again, this time with something that might have been amusement. She'd found a third option, one that neutralized the threat without causing permanent harm. "Clever girl," he murmured, then grabbed his pack. "Now we run." They moved through the darkness like ghosts. Echo's enhanced senses guiding them around the disabled soldiers who stumbled through the blackout. Marcus could hear them calling to each other, their voices tinged with confusion and growing unease. They'd expected to face a rogue scientist and a dangerous animal, not something that could reach out and casually disable their technology. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails that Echo seemed to know instinctively, Marcus wrestled with the implications of what he'd witnessed. Echo's abilities were advancing exponentially, far beyond anything his original research had predicted. She was becoming something unprecedented, not just physically enhanced, but cognitively evolved in ways that defied current understanding of neural development. Behind them, emergency flares began lighting up the landing zone as rescue teams converged on the disabled helicopter. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Valdez would send more teams, better equipped, with hardened electronics designed to resist electromagnetic interference. The hunt was far from over, and with each display of Echo's growing powers, the stakes continued to rise. The abandoned mining facility stretched across the desert floor like a metallic scar, its rusted buildings and twisted machinery casting jagged shadows in the moonlight. Marcus crouched behind a boulder 50 yards from the perimeter, watching armed guards patrol between searchlights. Beside him, Nova's muscles tensed, the dog's enhanced senses already cataloging threats Marcus couldn't perceive. 6 guards visible, Sarah whispered through the comm device. She was positioned on a ridge overlooking the facility's eastern approach. But thermal imaging shows at least 12 more inside the main building. Marcus checked his watch. They'd been observing for 2 hours, mapping patrol patterns and identifying weak points. The government had chosen this location well, isolated, defensible, with only a handful of access routes. But they couldn't have anticipated Nova's abilities. The ventilation system, Marcus murmured, studying the building's profile. Those intake vents are large enough, and they connect to the laboratory level where they're holding the other subjects. Nova pressed against his leg, a low whine escaping the dog's throat. Through their deepening mental connection, Marcus felt waves of distress. Nova sensed the imprisoned animals inside, felt their fear and confusion like physical pain. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, stroking Nova's head. "We'll get them out." The plan was risky. Marcus would create a distraction at the facility's main entrance, while Nova used the ventilation system to reach the laboratory. Sarah would monitor from her position, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. They all knew the odds were against them, but the alternative, leaving those animals to suffer the same experiments that had created Nova, was unthinkable. Marcus moved toward the facility's front gate, his heart pounding. He'd jury-rigged a small explosive device from materials they'd scavenged, nothing powerful enough to cause serious damage but sufficient to draw attention. As he approached the chain-link fence, memories of his own laboratory flooded back. The sterile corridors, the caged animals, the gradual erosion of his conscience as ambition overtook ethics. The explosion lit up the night sky, and immediately alarms began blaring. Guards rushed toward the main entrance, shouting orders and sweeping the area with flashlights. In the chaos, Nova slipped through the shadows like liquid darkness, leaping 15 feet to reach the ventilation intake. Marcus retreated to his observation post, watching through binoculars as guards searched for the source of the explosion. His hands shook as he waited for some sign that Nova had reached the laboratory. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then the facility's lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow, but Marcus smiled grimly. Nova had found the electrical systems. "Movement in the lab wing," Sarah reported. "Lots of it. I think Nova found our friends." Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, Marcus glimpsed flashes of movement, animals racing through corridors, guards scrambling to contain what appeared to be a mass breakout. Nova's influence was spreading to the other subjects, awakening whatever enhancements the government had forced upon them. A tremendous crash echoed across the desert as something smashed through the laboratory's exterior wall. In the red emergency lighting, Marcus saw them, a pack of animals unlike anything in nature. Dogs with metallic fur that gleamed like armor, cats whose eyes burned with an inner light, even what appeared to be a bear whose size defied biological limits. Nova emerged at the head of the group, moving with predatory grace. The guards opened fire, but the enhanced animals were too fast, too smart. They scattered in coordinated patterns, using the facility's own structures for cover, while Nova's telepathic influence guided their movements. It was like watching evolution in fast forward. Creatures that had been laboratory subjects hours before now functioned as a unified force with tactical awareness that surpassed their captors. "Marcus, we have a problem." Sarah's voice crackled through the comm. "Military vehicles approaching from the east. Looks like a full response team." The distant rumble of helicopters confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The government wasn't taking any chances this time. They'd brought overwhelming force to recapture or eliminate the escaped subjects. Nova's mental voice touched Marcus's consciousness, clearer than ever before. "Must go. Others need sanctuary." "The caves," Marcus said aloud, knowing Nova would understand. "The old copper mines 10 miles north. We scouted them yesterday." Without hesitation, Nova began leading the pack of enhanced animals toward the desert wilderness. They moved like nothing Marcus had ever seen, a fluid formation that adapted instantly to terrain changes and potential threats. The dogs ranged ahead as scouts, while the larger animals protected the group's flanks. It was coordination beyond mere instinct, a collective intelligence emerging from Nova's expanding abilities. As the animals vanished into the darkness, Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding. This wasn't just about genetic enhancement anymore. Nova and the others represented something entirely new, a bridge between humanity's present and an unimaginable future. The helicopters were closing fast, their searchlights sweeping the desert floor. Marcus began moving toward the extraction point where Sarah waited, knowing that their real journey was just beginning. The underground bunker felt like a tomb. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, lines of code streaming down multiple monitors as she worked to crack the encryption on Chen's stolen files. The air recycling system hummed overhead, a constant reminder of how deep they'd buried themselves beneath the abandoned subway station. Marcus paced behind her, Nova at his side. The dog's transformation over the past week had been remarkable and terrifying. Where once a small puppy had struggled to keep up, now a creature the size of a large wolf moved with predatory grace. Its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, watching Sarah's work with what looked like understanding. "Got it," Sarah whispered, leaning back as the final firewall crumbled. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, you need to see this." He moved to her shoulder, reading over the documents that filled her screen. The Lazarus Project files painted a picture more horrifying than he'd imagined. Genetic templates for dozens of species, all modified with the same base code he'd discovered in Nova. Dogs were just the beginning, the proof of concept. "Phase 2, he read aloud, his voice hollow. "Subject diversification across mammalian species. Projected timeline for human integration, 18 months. Nova's ears flicked forward, and the dog moved to the bunker's entrance. A low growl rumbled from its throat, barely audible but filled with warning. Sarah's hands froze over the keyboard. "How many people know about this place?" Marcus whispered. "Just Chen and—" Sarah's eyes widened. "Oh no, if they got to Chen." The first explosion rocked dust from the ceiling. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power cut out, bathing everything in hellish red. Nova's growl became a snarl, its hackles rising as footsteps echoed down the maintenance tunnel. "Back exit," Sarah hissed, already moving. She grabbed a portable drive, fingers flying as she copied the most critical files. Through the old subway platform, "There's a service ladder." The second explosion was closer, much closer. Smoke began filtering through the bunker's ventilation system, carrying the acrid smell of military-grade explosives. Marcus grabbed Nova, surprised when the dog allowed itself to be lifted despite its increased size. They followed Sarah through a narrow corridor lined with exposed pipes and electrical conduits. Behind them, he could hear voices. Calm, professional, coordinated. Dr. Marcus Chen, an amplified voice called through the smoke. "We know you're here. Surrender the specimen and Dr. Kim will be allowed to live." Sarah stumbled, catching herself against the wall. "Specimen," she spat. "They're talking about Nova like it's property." They reached the abandoned subway platform, a cavernous space that stretched into darkness in both directions. Sarah's flashlight beam found the service ladder she'd mentioned, a rusted metal framework leading up to a maintenance hatch 50 feet overhead. "You first," Marcus said, setting Nova down. The dog immediately took position between them and the bunker entrance, its entire body coiled with tension. Sarah started climbing, the metal rungs groaning under her weight after decades of neglect. Marcus waited, listening to the sounds of their pursuers growing closer. Heavy boots, radio chatter, the distinctive whine of electronic equipment powering up. "Come on," Sarah called from above. "They're going to—" The platform erupted in blinding white light. Military floodlights blazed from the tunnel entrance as figures in tactical gear poured onto the platform. Marcus counted at least 8 soldiers, all armed, all moving with practiced precision. Nova didn't wait for commands. The dog launched itself toward the nearest soldier with impossible speed, covering 30 feet in what seemed like a single bound. The man went down hard, his rifle clattering across the concrete as Nova spun toward the next target. Marcus had never seen anything move like that. Nova flowed between the soldiers like liquid shadow, too fast for their lights to track effectively. Shouts filled the air, then screams, then the sharp crack of rifle fire, muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice from above, urgent and afraid. He grabbed the ladder and started climbing, hand over hand as chaos erupted below. A bullet sparked off the metal near his head, then another. Behind him, Nova's snarls mixed with human cries of pain and confusion. Halfway up, he risked a glance down. Bodies lay motionless on the platform, but more soldiers were already emerging from the tunnels. And something else, a figure in a lab coat, carrying what looked like a tranquilizer rifle. "Target the specimen," the figure called. "Lethal force authorized." Nova looked up at Marcus, those impossibly intelligent eyes meeting his across the distance. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Then the dog turned back toward the new wave of soldiers, and Marcus understood what he was seeing. This wasn't random aggression or genetic enhancement gone wrong. Nova was choosing to fight, choosing to protect them. Sarah hauled him through the maintenance hatch just as the tranquilizer rifle fired. Below them, Nova's defiant howl echoed through the abandoned tunnels, a sound that carried notes of something that might have been human, something that might have been the future. The underground laboratory hummed with an energy that made Marcus's teeth ache. Banks of monitors displayed cascading genetic sequences, while containment units lined the walls like technological coffins. Dr. Helena Voss stood at the center of it all, her silver hair pulled back severely, watching Cypher with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Magnificent," she breathed, circling the reinforced enclosure where Cypher lay sedated. 3 years of theoretical work, and here it is, evolution incarnate. Marcus struggled against the restraints, binding him to a medical chair, the metallic taste of blood sharp on his tongue from where they'd struck him during capture. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The neural cascade alone could—" "Could what? Transform humanity?" Voss's laugh was crystalline and cold. "That's precisely the point, Dr. Chen. Your little pet represents the next phase of human development. We simply need to understand how to replicate its modifications." She gestured to a technician who began preparing a series of syringes filled with luminescent fluid, the same bioluminescent markers Marcus had seen in Cypher's bloodwork, but concentrated to an almost blinding intensity. "The original project was too conservative," Voss continued, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface. "Project Genesis was meant to create enhanced soldiers, but we were thinking too small. Why settle for improved humans when we could birth an entirely new species?" Through the observation window, Marcus could see Sarah and Jake being held in an adjacent chamber. Sarah's eyes met his through the glass, and he saw something there, not fear, but a fierce determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her analytical mind years ago. Cypher stirred in the containment unit, his eyes flickering open with that otherworldly blue radiance. Even sedated, the dog's presence seemed to pulse through the room, and several monitoring devices began registering anomalous readings. "Fascinating," Voss murmured, studying the data streams. "Even unconscious, it's broadcasting on quantum frequencies we can barely detect. The neural pathways aren't just enhanced, they're operating on entirely different principles." Marcus felt something brush against his consciousness, soft as a whisper but unmistakably alien. Cypher was awake, and despite the drugs coursing through his system, the dog was reaching out with his enhanced abilities. Images flashed through Marcus's mind, not visual memories, but pure information. Genetic sequences, protein configurations, the fundamental building blocks of Cypher's modifications. "The transformation isn't random," Marcus said, his voice hoarse but steady. "It's directed by quantum consciousness patterns. You can't just inject the serum and hope for the best. The neural architecture has to be prepared, or what?" Voss leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with scientific hunger. "Or the subject dies screaming as their synapses fire randomly until their brain burns out." Voss straightened, considering this. "Then we'll use you as the first test subject. Your familiarity with the creature should provide some resistance to neural rejection." The technician approached with the prepared syringes, but before he could reach Marcus, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Emergency lighting bathed everything in crimson as automated voices announced a containment breach. Cypher was standing in his supposedly inescapable enclosure, the reinforced walls around him spiderwebbed with cracks that glowed with residual energy. The sedatives that should have kept him unconscious for hours were being metabolized and expelled from his system in real time, his enhanced biology adapting faster than the drugs could take effect. "Impossible," Voss breathed, backing away from the containment unit. "The neural suppressors alone should have—" The unit exploded outward in a shower of glass and twisted metal. Cypher emerged, his form seeming to flicker between dimensions as space bent around him. The dog's eyes blazed with intelligence that transcended anything purely animal, and when he looked at Marcus, their connection snapped into place like a circuit completing. Marcus felt his restraints simply dissolve, the molecular bonds holding them together unraveling at the quantum level. He stood, marveling at how Cypher's abilities could extend beyond the physical into the realm of pure possibility. Security forces poured into the laboratory, but their weapons seemed useless against an opponent who existed partially outside normal space-time. Cypher moved like liquid light, phasing through solid barriers while simultaneously maintaining enough coherence to disable electronic systems with focused electromagnetic pulses generated by his enhanced neural activity. "The data!" Voss screamed to her technicians. "Download everything, we can't lose 3 years of research." But Cypher was already at the central computer core, his enhanced consciousness interfacing directly with the quantum processors. Terabytes of genetic research began corrupting as his alien neural patterns overwrote the stored information, replacing Voss's work with incomprehensible streams of evolutionary code. Marcus reached Sarah and Jake, using Cypher's quantum field to dissolve their restraints as well. Sarah's hand found his, her grip fierce and warm and absolutely real amidst the chaos of impossible science unfolding around them. "We need to go," she said, her voice cutting through the alarms, "before they bring in heavier containment protocols." Cypher bounded to them, his form solidifying back into something recognizably canine. But Marcus could see the change in his eyes. The dog had evolved again during captivity, pushed by stress and isolation into yet another phase of development. They were no longer just dealing with an enhanced animal. Cypher was becoming something entirely new. The compound erupted in chaos as Marcus and Luna sprinted through the emergency lighting, alarms shrieking around them like wounded animals. Behind them, the sound of boots thundered against metal flooring as Blackwood security forces mobilized. Marcus's lungs burned as he struggled to keep pace with Luna, who moved with an otherworldly grace despite the pandemonium. "The data cores," Marcus gasped, pointing toward a branching corridor. "We need those files before—" A pulse rifle blast scorched the wall inches from his head, showering them with sparks. Luna wheeled around, her eyes blazing with that familiar blue-white radiance. The approaching soldiers stumbled backward as an invisible force slammed into them, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. "No time," she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. "They're already here." Through the compound's reinforced windows, Marcus glimpsed the approaching aircraft, sleek, black shapes, cutting through the dawn sky like mechanical predators. Government interceptors, their weapons systems already powering up for a surgical strike. Whatever Blackwood had been planning, someone higher up the food chain had decided to cut their losses. Dr. Sarah Chen rounded the corner ahead of them, her lab coat torn and her face streaked with soot. "The primary lab is compromised," she shouted over the sirens. "They're purging everything, all the research, all the specimens." Marcus felt his heart sink. Years of genetic research, countless breakthrough discoveries that could revolutionize human understanding of evolution, all being systematically destroyed to cover someone's tracks. But as he looked at Luna, he realized the most important discovery was standing right beside him. "There's another way out," Chen continued, gesturing toward a maintenance access panel. "But we need to move now. They've locked down the primary exits and—" The lights cut out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Emergency power flickered on a moment later, casting everything in hellish red shadows. In that brief moment of blindness, Marcus heard something that chilled him to the core. The soft whir of automated systems coming online. Blackwood's final insurance policy. "Defense grid is active," Luna said, her enhanced senses apparently unimpaired by the darkness. "They're not just trying to stop us from leaving, they're trying to stop anyone from leaving." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't just about covering up illegal genetic research anymore. Someone had decided that everyone in this facility, including the researchers, knew too much to be allowed to survive. They reached the maintenance tunnel just as the first missile struck the compound's eastern wing. The explosion sent shockwaves through the steel framework, and Marcus was thrown against the wall hard enough to see stars. His ears rang as dust and debris rained down around them. "The neural interface," Chen gasped, pulling herself upright. "Marcus, before we go any further, you need to understand what they were really doing here. Luna isn't just genetically enhanced. She's a bridge. A bridge to what? To the next phase of human consciousness. Her brain doesn't just process information faster than ours. It processes information in ways that shouldn't be possible. Quantum entanglement at the cellular level, predictive modeling that borders on precognition, and something else, something that scares them more than anything. Another explosion rocked the facility, closer this time. Luna's eyes flared brighter as she pressed her hands against the tunnel wall, her expression distant and concentrated. "They're not just destroying the facility," she said quietly. "They're planning to blame it on a terrorist attack. Make it look like foreign agents tried to steal classified research and triggered a containment failure." "How can you possibly know that?" Marcus demanded. Luna turned to face him, and for a moment he saw something ancient and profound in her young features. "Because I can hear their communications, all of them. Every radio frequency, every encrypted channel, every digital pulse within a 50-mile radius. It's like having a conversation with the electromagnetic spectrum itself." The tunnel shook again as another missile found its target. Somewhere above them, voices screamed in panic as people tried desperately to escape a facility that had been designed to be inescapable. Marcus thought of all the researchers, the support staff, the security personnel who were just doing their jobs. They were all expendable now, collateral damage in someone's political calculation. "We have to help them," he said. "We can't save everyone," Chen replied, her voice heavy with regret. But we can make sure their work wasn't for nothing. The data I've been collecting, the real breakthrough research, it's not stored in any computer system they can purge. She tapped her temple. It's all up here. And if we can get out of this alive, we can make sure the world knows what they're really capable of, what humanity is really capable of. Luna placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he felt a strange warmth flow through him, not just physical comfort, but something deeper, a sense of connection that transcended ordinary human experience. "Then we run," he said. The emergency klaxons pierced through the underground facility as Marcus crouched behind an overturned laboratory table, his hand resting on Echo's trembling flank. The puppy's eyes glowed with that familiar electric blue intensity, but something was different now. The light pulsed in rhythmic waves, almost like a heartbeat made of pure energy. "They've sealed the primary exits," Sarah whispered, checking her tablet's security feed. "Hawthorne's deployed military units at every checkpoint." Marcus peered around the table's edge. Through the reinforced glass windows, he could see soldiers in black tactical gear moving through the corridors with mechanical precision. These weren't regular security forces. Their movements were too coordinated, almost synchronized, like they were operating on some kind of shared frequency. Echo whimpered, pressing closer against Marcus's leg. The puppy's unusual growth had accelerated over the past few days. He was now the size of a 6-month-old dog, though they'd only had him for 3 weeks. More disturbing was the way Echo seemed to react to threats before anyone else perceived them. "The ventilation system," Marcus said suddenly, remembering the facility's blueprints from his brief stint as a consultant here years ago. "There's an old maintenance tunnel that connects to the surface through the cooling towers." Sarah shook her head. "Those tunnels were sealed after the contamination incident in Sector 7. Not all of them." Marcus lifted Echo, feeling the puppy's accelerated heartbeat against his chest. The main exhaust shaft was too critical to seal completely. They just installed additional filtration. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the main corridor, growing closer. Echo's eyes blazed brighter, and Marcus felt something impossible, a whisper of awareness that didn't belong to him. Images flashed through his mind, the soldiers' positions, their weapons, even their intended movements. He was seeing through Echo's consciousness. "This way," he said, leading them toward a maintenance door marked with radiation warnings. They slipped through just as the laboratory door exploded inward. The soldiers swept the room with military efficiency, their weapons trained on every possible hiding spot. Marcus held his breath as they passed the maintenance entrance, but the soldiers continued their sweep without stopping. The maintenance tunnel was cramped and filled with humming machinery. Pipes dripped condensation, and the air thrummed with the vibration of massive ventilation fans somewhere above. Echo seemed more agitated here, his glow fluctuating wildly. "Marcus," Sarah grabbed his arm. "Look at this." She was pointing at a section of the tunnel wall where cables and pipes converged into a junction box. But that wasn't what had caught her attention. Growing along the pipes in thread-like patterns was something that looked almost organic, a crystalline structure that pulsed with the same blue light emanating from Echo. "It's some kind of neural network," Sarah breathed. "The genetic modifications aren't just affecting Echo. They're creating a connection to the facility's infrastructure." Marcus stared at the strange growth. Dr. Chen's final experiment. She wasn't just creating enhanced animals. She was developing a symbiotic relationship between biological and technological systems. Echo barked once, a sharp warning sound. The crystalline formations along the walls suddenly blazed with light, and Marcus felt another surge of shared consciousness. This time, the sensation was overwhelming. He could sense the entire facility, every person within it, every electronic system. Through this expanded awareness, he saw Hawthorne in the main control room, speaking into a secure communication device. The words came through as if Marcus was standing right beside him. "The specimen has exceeded all parameters. We're moving to final containment protocols. If the subject cannot be retrieved intact, authorization is granted for termination." The connection broke, leaving Marcus gasping. Echo was panting heavily, his small body radiating heat. "They're not just going to capture him," Marcus said. "They're prepared to kill him if necessary." Sarah checked her tablet again. "The surface access is just ahead, but there are thermal sensors. They'll detect us the moment we emerge." Marcus looked down at Echo, whose eyes were now solid blue, no longer showing any white. The puppy was changing before their eyes, evolving in real time. Whatever Dr. Chen had done, it was accelerating beyond anyone's predictions. "What if we don't try to hide?" Marcus asked. "What if we use Echo's abilities?" "You mean the connection to the facility's systems? Think about it. If he can interface with the infrastructure, maybe he can disrupt their sensors, create false readings." Sarah nodded slowly. "Or overload their systems entirely." Marcus knelt down, placing his hand on Echo's head. The moment they made contact, the shared consciousness returned, but this time, Marcus didn't fight it. He let himself merge with Echo's expanding awareness, feeling the vast network of systems throughout the facility. Together, they reached out through the crystalline pathways growing along the walls, touching every computer terminal, every sensor array, every electronic system in the building. The facility's technology seemed almost eager to respond, as if it had been waiting for this connection. Marcus smiled grimly. It was time to give Hawthorne a demonstration of what they were really dealing with. The abandoned warehouse trembled as another explosion rocked the building's foundation. Dr. Marcus Chen pressed his back against the concrete wall, clutching the modified neural interface device he'd jury-rigged from salvaged laboratory equipment. Across the debris-strewn floor, Shadow crouched low, the puppy's eyes glowing with an otherworldly blue light that pulsed in rhythm with something far beyond normal canine consciousness. "They've surrounded the perimeter," Sarah whispered, checking her tablet's thermal readings. The former government liaison had proven invaluable since switching sides, but Marcus could see the doubt creeping into her eyes as armed forces closed in from all directions. At least 40 operators, maybe more. Marcus nodded grimly. 3 months of running, hiding, and desperately trying to understand what Shadow truly was had led them here, to this moment where everything would either culminate in humanity's greatest breakthrough or its most devastating missed opportunity. The puppy had grown larger, his abilities expanding beyond anything Marcus had initially theorized. Shadow could now interface directly with electronic systems, manipulate electromagnetic fields, and demonstrate cognitive processing that suggested intelligence far exceeding human capacity. "The upload is almost complete," Marcus said, monitoring the data transfer on his makeshift equipment. "Once we get Shadow's genetic template and neural mapping into the distributed network, they can't suppress this anymore. Every university, every independent lab, every scientist who cares about truth will have access." Shadow's head tilted, those luminous eyes focusing on something only he could perceive. A low whine escaped his throat, not fear but warning. Marcus had learned to read these signals over their months together. Something was wrong, something beyond the obvious tactical situation. "Marcus," Sarah's voice carried new urgency, "I'm picking up massive energy readings from the north approach. This isn't standard military equipment." Before he could respond, the warehouse's north wall simply vanished. Not destroyed by explosives or breached by force, it dissolved into constituent atoms, leaving behind only empty space and a metallic taste in the air. Through the impossible opening stepped Director Harrison, flanked by 2 figures in environmental suits carrying devices Marcus didn't recognize. "Dr. Chen," Harrison's voice echoed with artificial amplification. "You've caused considerable inconvenience, but more importantly, you've interfered with a project whose scope you cannot possibly comprehend." Marcus stepped protectively closer to Shadow, feeling the neural interface device warm in his hands as it synchronized with the puppy's bioelectric field. "I understand enough. You created him as a weapon. You were going to use his abilities to control people, to rewrite human consciousness itself." Harrison's laugh was devoid of humor. "Control? Doctor, you still think too small. We weren't seeking to control humanity's evolution. We were trying to prevent its extinction." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Behind Harrison, the suited figures raised their devices, and the air itself began to shimmer with energy distortions. Shadow's growl deepened, harmonizing with frequencies that made Marcus's bones ache. The project began as a response to analysis we conducted 15 years ago, Harrison continued. Predictive modeling of human civilization's trajectory. Climate collapse, resource depletion, social fragmentation. We had perhaps 30 years before irreversible systemic failure. Shadow wasn't designed as a weapon, he was designed as an arc. Sarah's tablet sparked and died as electromagnetic interference flooded the warehouse. An arc for what? For human consciousness itself. The ability to transfer, preserve, and enhance human awareness beyond biological limitations. To ensure our species' survival, regardless of what happens to our dying planet. Harrison's environmental suit reflected the blue glow emanating from Shadow's eyes. But that requires the complete neural template, which means recovering our prototype intact. Marcus felt Shadow tense beside him, the puppy's muscles coiling for action. Through their connection, he sensed vast networks of information, probability matrices, and something that felt almost like sorrow. Shadow understood what was happening with devastating clarity. "You're wrong about one thing," Marcus said, his voice steadying as certainty crystallized within him. "Shadow isn't your prototype anymore. He's evolved beyond your original parameters. Haven't you, boy?" The puppy's response wasn't vocalized, but transmitted directly through the neural interface, a flood of data, emotion, and pure communication that left Marcus gasping. Shadow had indeed evolved, incorporating new genetic expressions, developing unprecedented neural pathways, becoming something entirely beyond what the original project had envisioned. More critically, Shadow had made a choice. The energy weapons Harrison's people carried suddenly went dark. Every electronic device in a 3-block radius shut down simultaneously. In the resulting silence, Shadow stood and faced Harrison directly, his small form radiating power that made the air itself vibrate. When he spoke, not barked, but spoke in a voice that somehow reached directly into their minds, the words carried weight of absolute finality. "I choose who carries the future forward, and I choose freely." The real battle was about to begin. The laboratory's emergency lights cast everything in hellish red as Marcus hauled himself through the collapsing corridor, Nexus pressed against his chest. The puppy's breathing was shallow, its usual luminescent eyes dim and flickering like dying stars. Behind them, the sound of reinforced concrete crashing down echoed through the facility as Director Chen's final gambit, a complete structural collapse, began to unfold. "You can't outrun this, Marcus," Chen's voice crackled through the failing intercom system. "If I can't have the specimen, no one can." Marcus stumbled as another explosion rocked the underground complex. His leg, injured in their escape from the containment chamber, screamed in protest, but he pushed forward. Nexus stirred weakly in his arms, and for a moment those extraordinary eyes opened, meeting his with an intelligence that still took his breath away. "I know, boy. I know it hurts." Marcus's voice cracked as he felt the puppy's pain echoing through their mental connection, a bond he'd only recently begun to understand. The genetic modifications he'd unknowingly helped create hadn't just given Nexus enhanced abilities, they'd created something unprecedented. A bridge between human and canine consciousness that represented evolution's next leap forward. The corridor ahead split into 2 paths. Marcus hesitated, his scientific mind automatically calculating odds and escape routes, when Nexus lifted his head slightly and looked toward the left passage. Even weakened, the puppy's enhanced senses were superior to anything human. They emerged into the main laboratory just as the ceiling supports began to buckle. Marcus's years of work, his attempts at redemption after the disastrous experiments that had cost him everything, lay in ruins around them. But none of that mattered now. Only Nexus mattered. "You think you've won something?" Director Chen stepped out from behind an overturned table, her military uniform torn and bloodied, a pistol trained on them. "You have no idea what you're protecting. That thing isn't just some enhanced animal. It's a weapon, a biological key that could remake human consciousness itself. Marcus backed against the laboratory wall, shielding Nexus with his body. That's exactly why it can't fall into the wrong hands. Our hands are the wrong hands. Chen's laugh was sharp and bitter. I've spent 15 years trying to give humanity an edge against what's coming. Climate collapse, resource wars, the slow extinction of our species. That creature represents salvation. It represents choice, Marcus said firmly. Evolution, not domination. You'd turn Nexus into a tool for control. I've seen your files, Chen. The planned breeding programs, the neural manipulation protocols. You want to create a master race with yourself at the top. Another section of ceiling crashed down, sending debris flying. Chen didn't flinch, her gun steady. Better that than watching humanity stumble into the dark. Nexus suddenly raised his head, and Marcus felt a surge of warmth through their connection. The puppy's eyes began to glow brighter, and Marcus understood. Even injured, even dying, Nexus was trying to protect him. No, Marcus whispered. But it was too late. A wave of psychic energy pulsed outward from the small form in his arms. Chen staggered, her eyes going wide as her consciousness was suddenly flooded with something beyond human experience. For just a moment, she saw what Nexus saw, the vast interconnectedness of all living things, the potential for cooperation instead of domination, for symbiosis instead of subjugation. The gun clattered to the floor. Chen fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. I didn't understand. It's not about control at all, is it? It's about connection. The building shuddered again, more violently this time. Marcus knew they had minutes at most before the entire structure came down. He looked at Chen, seeing in her face the same wonder and terror he'd felt when he first truly comprehended what Nexus represented. "Help us get out of here," he said simply. She nodded, scrambling to her feet. Together they ran for the emergency exit, Chen's security codes opening doors that would have trapped them otherwise. Behind them, the laboratory that had been both prison and birthplace for humanity's next evolutionary step collapsed into rubble. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, gasping in the cold mountain air. In the distance, Marcus could see government vehicles racing toward the facility, drawn by the explosions. There would be questions, investigations, consequences. But as he looked down at Nexus, seeing the puppy's eyes growing bright again in the fresh air, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Where will you go?" Chen asked quietly. Marcus smiled, feeling Nexus stir more strongly in his arms, their mental bond pulsing with renewed life and infinite possibility. "Forward," he said, and walked into the dawn.